One person enters the woods with nothing. No food, no shelter, no GPS, no teammates, just the clothes on their back, a knife, and 72 hours of pure wilderness between them and the finish line. Except today is not 72 hours. Today is the hardest single day on the calendar. Today is the 24-hour solo survival phase, and the instructors are not rooting for you to make it. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who respects what it takes to survive at the absolute edge of human capability, subscribe right now. Most people watch without ever hitting that button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to keep stories like this one coming. Now, let's talk about what actually happens when the military puts a human being through one of the most punishing single-day tests ever designed. There is a moment that every military survival school instructor knows about. They have seen it hundreds of times. It happens somewhere around hour 14 or 15 of the 24-hour solo phase. The student is sitting alone in whatever shelter they manage to throw together before dark. They are cold. They are hungry. Their hands are shaking. Their mind is starting to play tricks on them, and they have to make a decision that no amount of classroom training can fully prepare them for. They have to decide whether they are going to quit or whether they are going to survive. That moment is not an accident. The instructors built the test specifically to create that moment, because in real combat, in real downed aircraft scenarios, in real behind enemy line situations, that moment will come, and the military needs to know, before it sends someone into the field, whether that person will fold or whether they will fight through it. This is the story of what that test actually looks like from the inside. The survival training pipeline that most people think of when they hear military survival school is formally called SARE. That stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. It is a program run through multiple branches of the U.S. military, and it exists for one specific reason. Certain military personnel, pilots, special operations forces, air crew, intelligence officers, and others, have jobs that carry a statistically real chance of being captured, shot down, or isolated behind enemy lines. SARE exists to give those people a fighting chance when that happens. The course has multiple phases. There is classroom instruction. There is fieldcraft training. There is a resistance and interrogation phase that we will touch on shortly, because it connects directly to the psychological architecture of the survival test. But the piece that breaks people, the piece that filters the capable from the exceptional, is the field phase. And at the center of the field phase is the 24-hour solo survival evolution. Let me be precise about what we are talking about here. This is not a camping trip. This is not a wilderness retreat. This is a deliberate, structured, psychologically and physically demanding test, conducted in austere terrain under conditions of food deprivation, sleep restriction, and controlled stress. Every element of it is designed by people who have studied exactly how humans break down under real survival conditions, and then reverse engineered those conditions into a training environment. The location matters enormously. SERE schools operate in environments specifically chosen to be hostile. The Navy's primary SERE school operates out of Naval Air Station Brunswick in Maine, and later moved operations to other locations. The Air Force runs its course at Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington State, where the terrain is dense, Pacific Northwest forest, with unpredictable weather, steep ridgelines, and legitimate wilderness. Students are not placed in a manicured training field. They are put in real wilderness with real hazards. The trees are thick. The nights are genuinely cold. The terrain will twist an ankle if you are not paying attention. This is not theater. Now, here is where the foundation of the 24-hour test begins, because the solo phase does not start when a student walks into the woods. It starts days before. By the time a SERE student reaches the solo phase, they are already operating at a deficit. The course has been systematically reducing their caloric intake for days. The specific numbers vary by course and by classification level, but the general principle is consistent across all branches. Students in the field phase of SERE are not being fed anywhere close to a normal diet. Some courses provide minimal rations, a small amount of food per day that would not sustain normal energy levels. Other phases provide even less. Some students enter the solo phase having consumed only a fraction of their normal caloric requirement for the previous 48 to 72 hours. This is not cruelty. This is accuracy. A downed pilot in enemy territory does not have access to a mess hall. A special operator isolated behind enemy lines is not stopping for meals. The degradation in cognitive function, in physical capability, in emotional regulation that comes from caloric restriction is a real factor in survival situations. SERE trains people to operate through it, which means they first have to experience it in a controlled setting. Sleep is equally restricted before the solo phase. Again, this mirrors operational reality. Stress disrupts sleep. Fear disrupts sleep. Cold disrupts sleep. A real survival situation will not allow for 8 hours in a warm bed. So by the time the solo phase begins, students are already running on degraded fuel, both physical and mental. Add to that the cumulative stress of the preceding days. The course has been pushing them. Instructors are not friendly. The environment is deliberately uncomfortable, and students know that somewhere ahead of them is the resistance phase, the part of SEER that involves simulated capture, interrogation, and resistance training. That knowledge sits in the back of every student's mind like a weight they cannot set down. Then the instructors send them into the woods alone. The briefing that precedes the solo phase is deliberately minimal. Students are told what they need to know about safety, about the boundaries of their assigned area, about emergency signaling. Beyond that, they are given their task and their timeline. 24 hours, survive, demonstrate the skills you have been taught, we will evaluate, and then they are alone. The first thing most students describe is the silence. Coming from a group environment, from the constant noise and activity of the preceding training days, the sudden absence of other people is disorienting in a way that is hard to fully describe unless you have experienced it. There is a specific kind of quiet that exists in wilderness at night that is completely different from the quiet of a room or a building. It is alive, things move in it, branches crack, wind shifts, animals move, and the human brain, particularly a brain that is already stressed and calorie depleted, begins to process that alive quiet as threat. This is the first mental battle of the 24-hour test. Managing the psychology of isolation. Military survival instructors who have studied the documented survival cases, the actual recorded accounts of people who have been stranded, downed, isolated, and either survived or did not, consistently identify a core finding. The people who survive are not always the physically strongest. They are not always the best trained. The most consistent predictor of survival outcome is the ability to manage psychological state, to stay calm, to think clearly, to take action rather than freeze. The 24-hour solo is, at its core, a psychological stress inoculation test wrapped inside a physical skills test. The instructors know this. They designed it that way. But the skills part is not simple either. Let's walk through exactly what a student is expected to accomplish during those 24 hours, because the task list alone is enough to understand why this test breaks people. Shelter is the first priority in almost every military survival framework. The human body's ability to regulate temperature is remarkable, but it has hard limits. Hypothermia can kill a person in conditions that do not even feel that cold to a civilian. Wet conditions at 50 degrees Fahrenheit have killed people who underestimated the risk. SERI students are trained in the principle of protection before everything else, because a dead person cannot evade, cannot resist, cannot escape. Building a military standard debris shelter in real wilderness with no tools beyond a knife and whatever the environment provides is harder than it looks. A debris shelter requires collecting and processing an enormous volume of natural material, leaves, branches, pine needles, bark, any organic matter that creates dead airspace and acts as insulation. The structure has to be built to specific proportions. Too big and your body heat will not warm the interior. Too small and you cannot get into it. The entrance has to face the right direction relative to wind. The site has to be chosen carefully to avoid drainage, widowmaker branches overhead, and terrain that will funnel cold air. In training conditions with full energy and no time pressure, an experienced person can build a functional debris shelter in about an hour. In the solo phase, running on a caloric deficit, with fading daylight and rising anxiety, that same task takes significantly longer and requires sustained concentration that an exhausted brain does not want to provide. Students who rush the shelter and build something inadequate pay for it in the middle of the night, when the temperature drops and the insulation fails, and suddenly staying warm becomes a full-time survival problem instead of a resolved one. Students who take too long on shelter may not have time to complete their other tasks before dark. Fire is the next critical element, and fire is where many students discover a gap between what they understood in the classroom and what they can actually execute under real conditions. Military survival training teaches multiple fire-starting methods. Friction fire, specifically the bow drill method, is the foundational primitive technique. 2 pieces of wood, a spindle, a fireboard, a handhold, and a bow, made from a bent stick and a bootlace. The friction between the spindle and the fireboard generates a coal. The coal is transferred to a tinder bundle. The tinder bundle is carefully nursed into flame. Done correctly, it works. Done under the pressure of the solo phase, with shaking hands and depleted energy, and the knowledge that if you fail, you will be cold tonight, it is one of the most frustrating tasks a human being can attempt. The bow drill requires specific wood combinations. Not every tree produces wood that works for friction fire. Students have to identify appropriate species, process the wood to the right diameter and moisture content, and then execute the physical technique correctly. The bow must move at the right speed with the right pressure. Too slow and there is not enough friction. Too much pressure and the spindle binds. The handhold has to be held at a precise angle. Any deviation in form degrades the result. There are students who have practiced the bow drill dozens of times in classroom settings, who cannot execute it during the solo phase. Not because the technique stopped working, because their hands are shaking, because they are hungry, because they are cold, because they are alone in the dark and the emotional weight of the situation is interfering with the fine motor control the technique requires. This is intentional. This is the test. The instructors know that in a real survival situation, the conditions will never be ideal. They need to see whether students can execute under degraded conditions or whether they fall apart when execution gets hard. Students who do succeed in making fire describe it as a turning point in the psychological arc of the 24 hours. Fire does more than provide heat. It provides light. It provides a focal point. It provides a psychological anchor against the darkness and the isolation. Every survival psychologist and every military survival instructor who has studied this phenomenon says the same thing. Fire changes how a person feels about their situation. It shifts the internal narrative from, "I am in trouble," to, "I can handle this." Water procurement is the third element. The human body can survive approximately 3 weeks without food under the right conditions. It can survive approximately 3 days without water, and cognitive function degrades significantly long before that. Dehydration amplifies every other stressor. It makes cold feel colder. It makes fatigue feel more overwhelming. It accelerates the psychological deterioration that the solo phase is already deliberately inducing. Students in the solo phase are responsible for finding and treating their own water. Natural sources, streams, springs, standing water, all carry potential contamination. Military survival training teaches chemical treatment methods, boiling and improvised filtration, each appropriate for different situations and different available resources. The student has to locate a water source within their assigned area, assess it, and treat it appropriately. This sounds straightforward. In a wilderness environment under stress with no map, no GPS, and fading light, finding a reliable water source requires navigation skills, terrain reading ability, and patience that an exhausted, hungry student may not feel they have to spare. Food procurement is on the list as well, but the instructors are realistic about what is achievable in 24 hours. The caloric value of what can be foraged or trapped in a single day in most wilderness environments is minimal. Students are trained in plant identification for their specific training region, in improvised trapping techniques, in basic fishing methods. But the food piece of the solo phase is less about actual caloric gain and more about demonstrating the knowledge and the mindset. Can this student think about food procurement methodically and correctly, even when they are already hungry and tired? That is the question being answered. Signaling is the fourth element. In a real survival situation, one of the primary objectives is to facilitate rescue. A survivor who is hidden and invisible to rescuers is not surviving effectively. They are waiting to die. Military survival training teaches the principles and techniques of ground-to-air signaling, signal mirrors, signal fires, ground-to-air symbols laid out in open terrain, and other methods of attracting attention from above. During the solo phase, students may be required to demonstrate signaling knowledge and technique. The specific requirements vary by course level and classification, but the underlying principle is constant. Even in isolation, even under stress, even after a night without adequate sleep and a day without adequate food, a trained survivor must be able to shift from a shelter and stay warm mindset to a be seen mindset when the opportunity presents itself. Now let's talk about the night, because the night is where the 24-hour test becomes most viscerally real. The transition from daylight to darkness in a wilderness survival situation is not just a change in lighting conditions, it is a psychological shift of significant magnitude. Tasks that were difficult during the day become harder in the dark. Sounds that were manageable in daylight become amplified and threatening after dark. The sense of isolation intensifies. The physical sensations of cold, of hunger, of fatigue, all feel sharper at 2 in the morning than they did at 2 in the afternoon. Series students who have written or spoken about their solo phase experiences consistently describe the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning as the hardest part. This is not accidental. Instructors know exactly what the human circadian rhythm does in those hours. The body's natural temperature regulation hits a low point in the early morning hours. The brain's cognitive resources, already depleted, are running at their minimum. Emotional regulation is at its weakest. This is the window in which students are most likely to make poor decisions, to catastrophize, to consider using their signaling device to call for extraction. The extraction option is real. CRE is a voluntary program in the legal sense that students can choose to leave. There are specific protocols for medical emergency and for voluntary termination. Students who feel they cannot continue can signal for extraction. The instructors will come get them. But using that option ends the training. It is documented, it is known, and for students whose career track requires SARE completion, it has consequences. More importantly, it is a data point about that person's capacity to function in an actual survival situation. Which means the decision to call for extraction during the solo phase is not taken lightly by anyone on either side of that equation. The instructors know the night is when most voluntary extractions happen. They have data on this. They know which hours are hardest. They have calibrated the test accordingly. They are not trying to drive students to extraction. They are trying to drive students to the edge of it and see who finds a way back. Here is what the students who make it through consistently report about that edge moment. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is a conversation that happens entirely inside their own head, somewhere in the dark, in a debris shelter that may or may not be keeping them adequately warm, with no audience and no one to perform for. The conversation goes something like this. I could stop. This is miserable. I am cold and I am hungry, and I am tired, and nothing about this is comfortable. And then, but I am not in danger. I know how to handle this. I have the skills. I just have to keep going. That cognitive reframe, from this is miserable to I can handle this, is the entire point of the 24-hour solo. Because in an actual survival situation, the stakes of that internal conversation are not a completed training requirement. They are life and death. Let's talk about what the instructors are actually watching for, because students sometimes assume they are being left completely alone during the solo phase. They are not. Instructors maintain observation, not constant close observation, but they know where students are. They have checked safety perimeters. They have protocols for any student who shows signs of genuine medical distress. The solo phase is monitored from a distance with a precision that the students do not fully appreciate in the moment. What are the instructors evaluating? Several things simultaneously. First, the physical tasks. Did the student build a functional shelter using correct techniques? Is there evidence of a fire attempt? Did the student demonstrate water procurement knowledge? Is there evidence of signaling capability? These are observable outcomes that can be assessed when instructors make their rounds and when the student is debriefed. Second, and more critically, the instructors are evaluating decision-making under stress. Did the student prioritize correctly? Did they address shelter before fire, fire before food? Did they choose a site with good natural advantages? Did they read the terrain, or did they pick a spot based on convenience that created problems later? These decisions reveal how deeply the training has been internalized, how well the student can think, rather than just execute memorized steps. Third, the instructors are watching for psychological indicators. Specifically, they are looking for the difference between manageable distress and incapacitation. Every student is going to be uncomfortable. Every student is going to have hard moments. That is not a concern. What would be a concern is a student who has become so overwhelmed that they are no longer able to function, no longer able to make decisions, no longer able to take the basic actions required to maintain their safety. That is the line between training stress and a safety issue, and the instructors are trained to identify it. Now, the 24-hour solo does not exist in isolation. It is the centerpiece of a larger field phase, and what happens immediately after the solo phase connects directly to why the solo is designed the way it is. After students complete the solo phase and are recovered by instructors, they are moved almost immediately into the next evolution. And the next evolution is not rest. It is not a hot meal and a debrief. The next evolution is the evasion phase, followed by the resistance and interrogation phase. This sequencing is deliberate. The military is not training people who will only have to survive in comfortable circumstances. The military is training people who may have to survive, then evade, then endure capture, then resist interrogation, all in sequence, all without adequate rest or food, all while maintaining the discipline and mental fortitude that prevents them from compromising classified information or breaking under pressure. The solo phase is designed to deplete students to a specific state before they go into the subsequent phases. An instructor who was involved in SEER curriculum development once explained it this way in a publicly available context. We need to know what a person does when they are genuinely stressed, not when they are acting stressed in a controlled environment with a full stomach and a good night's sleep behind them. The field phase puts them in a state where the stress is real, and the responses we see are real. That is the information we need. The evasion phase that follows the solo puts students into a scenario where they are being actively pursued. Instructors playing the role of opposing forces are hunting them through the training area. Students have to apply land navigation skills, movement techniques, and evasion principles while already fatigued from the solo phase. The sequence is cumulative by design. And then comes the resistance phase, which is where SERI becomes truly singular among military training programs. The resistance and interrogation training is classified in its specifics. What is publicly known is that students are put through a simulated prisoner of war scenario. They are subject to stress positions, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and simulated interrogation techniques. The purpose, legally and doctrinally established, is to train students in the code of conduct and to inoculate them against the psychological mechanisms that actual hostile interrogators use to extract information. The resistance phase is not torture. It is not designed to harm students. It has strict medical oversight and specific legal boundaries, but it is genuinely hard. It is designed to be genuinely hard, and every student who enters the resistance phase has already been through the solo phase and the evasion phase. They enter it depleted, tired, and stressed. The progression from solo to evasion to resistance is not just a schedule, it is a deliberate building of cumulative stress that mirrors, in a controlled and survivable way, the actual progression of events that a downed pilot or captured service member might experience. Each phase prepares the student for the next. Each phase builds on what came before. This is why the 24-hour solo matters so much. It is not just a test of wilderness survival skills. It is the first major filter in a cumulative stress pipeline. Students who come apart during the solo phase are not going to perform better when they are exhausted and hungry and being interrogated. Students who find their footing during the solo, who discover in those 24 hours that they can handle genuine hardship and keep functioning, carry that knowledge into every subsequent phase and into every real-world scenario they will ever face. There is a specific concept in military psychology that is relevant here. It is called stress inoculation. The idea is straightforward. Exposure to moderate, manageable doses of stress in a controlled environment with appropriate support and recovery increases a person's resilience when facing high-stress situations later. The immune system analogy is apt. A vaccination introduces a controlled exposure to a pathogen in order to build resistance against a real infection. Stress inoculation introduces controlled exposure to psychological and physical hardship in order to build resistance against real-world crises. The 24-hour solo is a stress inoculation event, but it is also more than that. It is a diagnostic. The instructors learn things about their students during the solo phase that they could never learn in a classroom. They learn how a person responds to genuine isolation. They learn whether a person's problem-solving degrades or holds up under caloric restriction. They learn whether a person can manage the internal conversation that turns a miserable night in the woods into a survival success instead of a crisis. The students learn things about themselves too. This is perhaps the least discussed but most significant outcome of the 24-hour solo. Most people who go through it have never spent a night alone in wilderness under genuine stress. They have never had to discover their own floor, the lowest point they can reach and still function. The solo phase takes them there and forces them to find out what they are made of. The instructors know this. They know that students come out of the solo phase with new information about themselves. Some of that information is encouraging. Some of it is humbling. All of it is useful. A person who knows where their floor is and has been there and come back from it is a different kind of operator than a person who has never been tested at that level. Let's talk specifically about some of the documented physical realities of what happens to the human body and mind during the solo phase, because the physiology is as interesting as the psychology. After 24 to 48 hours of significant caloric restriction, the human body begins shifting its fuel source. Normally, the body runs primarily on glucose derived from carbohydrates. When glucose runs low, the body begins burning stored fat and eventually begins drawing on muscle protein as well. This metabolic shift, called ketosis, is not immediately dangerous for most healthy people, but it comes with effects: brain fog, irritability, difficulty with complex cognitive tasks. These are the exact conditions the solo phase asks students to perform in. The specific cognitive functions that degrade fastest under caloric restriction are the ones most critical to survival decision-making. Executive function, which is the brain's ability to plan, sequence, and evaluate options, is among the first capabilities to suffer. Working memory, the ability to hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously while making a decision, also degrades. Emotional regulation weakens, which means minor frustrations feel larger and setbacks feel more devastating than they would under normal conditions. These are not theoretical concerns. These are documented, measurable changes in human brain function. The SARE curriculum is built with explicit awareness of them, the skills that students are taught, the prioritized action sequence, the specific techniques, the mental frameworks for maintaining calm, are all designed to be executable even when executive function is degraded. They are designed to run on whatever cognitive fuel remains after the body has been running at a deficit. This is why the military invests in repetitive, deeply grooved training for survival skills rather than conceptual understanding alone. A person who intellectually understands how to build a bow drill but has only done it twice is not going to succeed at 2 in the morning when their hands are shaking and their cognitive executive function is running on empty. A person who has done it 100 times and built the motor memory into their muscle has a different chance. The skill runs on a different track, one that is less vulnerable to the cognitive degradation of stress and caloric restriction. Temperature management deserves its own discussion because it is one of the variables that can turn a difficult training event into a medical emergency. The training areas used for SEER are not selected for pleasant climate. Fairchild Air Force Base in Washington State presents conditions that include cold rain, sub-freezing overnight temperatures in certain seasons, and the kind of damp cold that penetrates clothing and makes hypothermia a genuine risk within hours if shelter is inadequate. Students know this. Instructors know this. Medical oversight accounts for it. But the knowledge that hypothermia is a real risk does not protect a student who builds an inadequate shelter. Hypothermia develops in stages. In the early stage, the body shivers. Shivering is a metabolic process that generates heat, and it works, but it burns calories at a significant rate. A student who is already calorie depleted and then spends 3 hours shivering to compensate for a shelter that is not insulating well enough is burning resources they cannot afford to lose. They are trading cognitive and physical capacity to generate warmth that a better shelter would have provided for free. This is the compounding nature of survival mistakes. One error: a shelter built too large, a site chosen without checking drainage, a fire that failed and used up the dry tinder without producing a flame, creates a cascade. Each mistake demands more resources from a system that is already running at a deficit. Students who understand this principle conceptually before the solo phase and who remember it under the pressure of the solo phase make different choices than students who are just trying to get through each task as it comes. The instructors watch for the difference. There is another element of the solo phase that rarely gets discussed in public accounts, and it is the role of food procurement beyond the caloric question. The act of attempting to find food, of thinking about food procurement in a systematic and skilled way, serves a specific psychological function during the solo phase. It gives the student something to do. This sounds trivial until you think about it more carefully. One of the primary psychological hazards in a survival situation is the absence of purposeful activity. When there is nothing to do, the mind fills the void with anxiety, with catastrophizing, with circular thinking that builds fear instead of resolving it. Military survival training addresses this explicitly with the concept of keeping yourself busy, of having a task list, of treating the survival situation as a problem to be solved through continuous purposeful action. Food procurement, even when the expected caloric return is minimal, occupies the hands and the mind. It requires observation of the environment, which builds situational awareness. It requires movement, which generates warmth and burns off the nervous energy that anxiety produces. It requires the application of specific learned skills, which reinforces the student's identity as a capable person rather than a helpless victim. The instructors are not under any illusion that a student is going to forage enough calories in 24 hours to meaningfully change their energy status. That is not the point of the food procurement requirement. The point is what the activity does for the student's psychology. A person who is actively hunting for food in a methodical and skilled way is experiencing their situation completely differently than a person who is sitting in their shelter, waiting for the 24 hours to end. Now let's talk about what separates the students who perform well in the solo phase from the students who struggle, because this is where the real lessons of the test live. The first separator is pre-mission preparation and mindset. Students who enter the solo phase having mentally rehearsed their action sequence, having committed to a clear priority framework, and having set a realistic internal expectation about discomfort, perform significantly better than students who enter hoping the experience will be less hard than they have been told it will be. The military calls this mental preparation, and it is not a soft concept. It is a documented performance variable. The students who struggle most are consistently those who resist the reality of their situation rather than accepting it and working within it. They spend mental energy wishing conditions were different, wishing they had more food, wishing it were warmer, wishing the shelter were easier to build. That expenditure of energy on wishes rather than action is a luxury a survival situation does not allow, and the solo phase makes that lesson viscerally and unforgettably clear. The second separator is task priority discipline. Students who have internalized the survival priority sequence and apply it correctly, even under stress, consistently outperform students who improvise their priorities based on immediate comfort. The classic example is fire before shelter. Fire is warm, visible, and emotionally satisfying. A student who starts a fire first because they are cold and fire sounds good, but who has not yet built adequate shelter, may find themselves warm for 2 hours and then cold for 6 when the fire burns down, and the poorly insulated shelter cannot maintain temperature. The student who built adequate shelter first and then built fire has addressed the more durable priority first. Their night will be harder in the first 2 hours and easier in the subsequent 10. This is not an abstract principle. SEER students who have been through the solo phase and debriefed on their performance consistently cite priority errors as among the most impactful mistakes they made. And they cite their prior classroom training about priority sequence as the conceptual knowledge they wish they had trusted more completely. The third separator is resilience in the face of technique failure. The bow drill fails. The first shelter site is wrong and has to be abandoned. The water source turns out to be further than the terrain reading suggested. These are not exceptional events in the solo phase. They are expected events. The question is whether the student treats a technique failure as evidence that they cannot succeed, or as a problem to be diagnosed and corrected. Students who have developed what psychologists call a growth orientation, the belief that failure is information rather than verdict, recover from setbacks during the solo phase much faster than students who interpret every setback as confirmation that they are not going to make it. The instructors see this consistently. The student who fails the bow drill 3 times and diagnoses why, checks the wood moisture, adjusts the spindle angle, modifies the notch geometry, usually succeeds on the 4th or 5th attempt. The student who fails the bow drill 3 times and sits back in defeat, having decided that the environment or the technique or their own capability is fundamentally broken, is in serious trouble. The fourth separator is one that no amount of physical training can fully provide. It is the specific capacity to sit with discomfort without resolving it, to be cold and not panic, to be hungry and not catastrophize, to be alone in the dark with nothing changing for several hours, and to use that time productively rather than spending it in an escalating anxiety spiral. This capacity is partly temperamental. Some people have a naturally higher tolerance for ambiguity and discomfort, but it is also trainable, and SEER training, across all its phases, is specifically designed to build it. The solo phase is the purest test of whether that training has been internalized. The students who perform best in the solo phase are often not the ones who have the most physical training or the most outdoor experience. They are the ones who have the most stable relationship with their own minds, who can observe their own distress without being controlled by it, who can say to themselves, "I am uncomfortable right now, and that is appropriate given this situation, and my job is not to eliminate the discomfort but to function effectively despite it." This is a remarkably sophisticated psychological skill. It is a skill that has more in common with what mindfulness practitioners describe than with what most people associate with military toughness. But the military has known for decades that the hardest-looking physical specimens do not always perform best in the most psychologically demanding environments. The person who survives is not always the strongest. They are almost always the most mentally stable. Let's talk about the debrief, because the debrief is where the 24-hour solo becomes transformative rather than just difficult. After students are recovered from the solo phase and moved through the subsequent evolutions, there is a structured debrief. Instructors who have observed or evaluated each student's solo performance provide feedback. The debrief is not punitive. It is analytical. What did you do? Why did you make that decision? What happened as a result? What would you do differently? The purpose of the debrief is to convert experience into learning. The solo phase by itself provides experience. The debrief provides the analytical framework that turns that experience into durable knowledge. Students who perform the debrief honestly and with genuine intellectual engagement come out of the process with an understanding of their own decision-making patterns, strengths, and vulnerabilities that they could not have gotten any other way. This is one of the things that makes Sarir, and particularly the solo phase, genuinely singular among training programs. It is not just designed to stress people. It is designed to teach them about themselves under stress. And the debrief makes that teaching explicit, documented, and actionable. Former SEER instructors who have spoken publicly about the program describe the most important outcome not as the technical skills students demonstrate, but as the self-knowledge they gain. A student who goes through the 24-hour solo and the subsequent debrief knows something about themselves that they did not know before. They know where their floor is. They know which stressors affect them most significantly. They know which mental habits serve them in crisis and which ones undermine them. That is information they will carry for the rest of their career and the rest of their lives. For pilots specifically, the population that SEER was originally designed for, this self-knowledge is operationally critical. A pilot who does not know how they respond to genuine fear, genuine isolation, genuine physical hardship is flying with an unknown variable. A pilot who has been through the solo phase and the debrief, who has sat with that self-knowledge and worked through its implications, is flying with much better information about their own capabilities and limitations. That information matters when the aircraft is going down, and the decisions being made in the next 60 seconds will determine whether that person survives or does not. There is also a community dimension to the solo phase that deserves attention, even though the solo by definition is a solitary experience. Students in SEER are going through the same course together. They know what each other has been through. When the solo phase ends and they are recovered and debriefed, there is a specific kind of connection that forms among people who have shared a genuinely hard experience. This is the same phenomenon that creates the extraordinarily strong bonds in special operations communities, in combat units, in any group of people who have gone through something genuinely difficult together. The solo is solo, but the course is shared. And the shared difficulty of the course creates a foundation for the kind of trust that military units need to function at the highest levels. People who know that their teammates have been through the fire, literally and figuratively, and came through it, have a different kind of confidence in those teammates than people whose knowledge of each other comes only from benign shared experiences. Now, it is worth stepping back and situating the 24-hour solo in the broader context of military survival training globally, because the United States is not the only country that has developed this kind of program, and the comparison is illuminating. The British military's survival training, conducted through SARA courses run by the Joint Services SARA Training Organization, has similar structural elements to the American program: caloric restriction, field phase, solo evolution, resistance training. The British version has a particularly demanding reputation for its cold weather phase, which takes place in conditions that push physical hardship to significant levels. British Special Operations Forces, including the SAS and SBS, have their own survival and escape training that is considered among the hardest in the world. The Israeli Defense Forces run survival training for pilots and certain special operations forces that incorporates desert survival components unique to their operational environment. The ability to find water in a desert environment, to manage heat rather than cold, to navigate featureless terrain without landmarks, represents a completely different set of survival skills than those required in a Pacific Northwest forest. But the psychological core of the training, the isolation, the stress inoculation, the test of whether a person can function under genuine deprivation, is structurally identical. Australian Defence Force survival training, particularly for special operations units and aircrew, incorporates both tropical and desert environments, reflecting Australia's geographic diversity. The specific hazards of tropical survival, venomous wildlife, rapidly spreading infection from minor wounds, the difficulty of navigation in dense jungle, make the tropical phase a different kind of challenge from the temperate forest environment of Fairchild. But again, the psychological architecture is the same. What this international comparison reveals is that across very different countries, very different militaries, and very different cultural approaches to military service, the people who design survival training have converged on the same fundamental insight. The 24-hour solo, or its equivalent, is the test that cannot be faked. It puts a person alone, takes away the social scaffolding that normally supports human functioning, imposes physical hardship that degrades cognitive and emotional resources, and then asks whether that person can still perform. The answer to that question tells the training system something about that person that no other test can tell it, and the answer is critically important for anyone whose job description includes the possibility of surviving alone in a hostile environment. There is one more element of the 24-hour solo that has not yet been addressed, and it may be the most important one. It is the element that stays with students long after the training is over, long after the skills have been practiced and refined, and the course has become a memory rather than a present experience. Every person who goes through the 24-hour solo and completes it carries a specific piece of knowledge for the rest of their life. The knowledge is this: I have been alone in the dark, in the cold, without enough food, without the support of other people, and I made it. I did not quit. I did not fall apart. I found my floor and I did not stay there. This is not a small thing. This is not a certificate to hang on a wall. This is a lived experience of self-efficacy that changes how a person relates to difficulty for the rest of their life. People who have this experience describe it in similar terms across very different backgrounds and very different careers. They say that after the solo, hard things feel different. Not easy. Hard things still feel hard, but they feel survivable. The emotional weight that very difficult situations carry is somehow lighter for a person who already knows, from direct experience, that they can come through genuinely hard things and keep functioning. Psychologists who study resilience call this experience mastery. The mastery experience, the specific moment when a person discovers through direct confrontation that they can handle something they were not sure they could handle, is one of the most powerful builders of durable psychological resilience that exists. More powerful than being told you can handle hard things, more powerful than watching someone else handle hard things. The direct personal experience of going through something genuinely difficult and coming out the other side changes the structure of a person's relationship with difficulty itself.